Ethan moved through the jungle like a shadow, his body low, his breathing controlled. The alien blood drying on his hands carried no weight in his mind. There was no guilt, no hesitation. These creatures had taken his team, had laughed as they slaughtered them like animals. Now he was the one hunting. The jungle was his ally, the darkness his weapon. He had spent years fighting wars in places just like this. He knew how to use the terrain, how to make himself unseen until the moment he struck. The Zarkuan soldiers were regrouping. He could hear their guttural voices crackling through the stolen comm unit clipped to his belt. They were confused, but not yet afraid. That would come soon enough. They believed he was just another human, just another desperate animal fighting against the inevitable. They didn't understand what he was. He moved swiftly, circling the clearing where their main force had gathered. 5 of them now, their weapons glowing softly in the dim light, their eyes scanning the shadows. They were adjusting their tactics, forming a tighter perimeter, no longer underestimating him. Good. It wouldn't save them. Ethan had no illusions about what this was. He wasn't simply fighting for survival. He was making a statement, sending a message in blood and broken bodies. Humans were not prey. He pulled a jagged piece of metal from the remains of the drone he had destroyed earlier, running his fingers over the sharp edges. It would do. One of the Zarkuan broke from the group, stepping toward the treeline with slow, deliberate movements. This one was cautious, more experienced. Ethan let him come closer. He felt the way of the jungle around him, the way the trees swallowed sound, the way the damp air carried the scent of metal and sweat. He waited until the alien was close enough that he could hear its breath, then struck. The shard of metal slid deep into the Zarkuan's neck before it could make a sound. Ethan caught its body, lowering it silently to the ground. The alien's eyes widened in disbelief as its life drained away, but Ethan had already moved on. He left the body propped against a tree, facing the others. A message, a roar of rage broke the quiet. They had seen it. The soldiers tightened their formation, their weapons raised. Ethan crouched in the undergrowth, watching as their discipline started to fray. They were warriors, but they were also hunters, used controlling the battlefield. He was taking that control from them, piece by piece. One of them broke first, frustration overriding caution. The Zarkuan turned sharply, stepping forward, his weapon raised. Ethan had positioned himself perfectly. As the alien turned, he sprang, grabbing the warrior's wrist and twisting sharply. Bone snapped. The rifle dropped. Ethan caught it midair and fired, the plasma bolt tearing through the soldier's chest before the others could react. Chaos erupted. The remaining 3 turned their weapons toward him. But Ethan was already gone, disappearing into the jungle before they could get a clear shot. The underbrush burned where their plasma fire struck, but he was always one step ahead, using the flickering glow of their own weapons to misdirect them. He could hear their breathing, heavy and uncertain. They were starting to fear him. He kept moving, forcing them to separate as they tried to track him through the dense jungle. The one on his left was too slow. Ethan circled back, stepping silently behind the alien just as it realized its mistake. A sharp twist snapped its neck before it could scream. Only 2 left. The comm unit crackled with rapid, panicked speech. The remaining Zarkuan were calling for reinforcements. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had hoped to take them all before they could signal for backup, but it didn't matter. Let them come. He had no intention of running. He climbed a thick tree, pressing his back against the rough bark as he studied the last 2 soldiers. They had moved closer together, covering each other's blind spots. They had learned. Too late. Ethan pulled the plasma rifle to his shoulder, steadying his aim. He had no interest in drawn-out fights. 1 shot. The alien on the left crumpled, a smoldering hole in its skull. The last Zarkuan froze, its breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Ethan could feel the shift, the moment where the alien understood it was no longer the hunter. It turned slowly, its weapon lowered, its eyes searching the shadows. Ethan stepped forward, into the dim glow of the burning foliage. The Zarkuan took a step back. "This is what it feels like," Ethan said, his voice low. He raised the rifle. The alien didn't beg. It simply closed its eyes. The shot was clean. Ethan exhaled, lowering the rifle. The jungle was silent again, but he knew it wouldn't last. The reinforcements were coming. He could feel it in the electric charge of the air, in the distant hum of approaching ships. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Ethan watched the distant glow of descending dropships, their engines humming like a swarm of mechanical wasps. Reinforcements. More Zarkuan warriors, more heavily armed, more experienced. They had learned too late that he was not prey, and now they were sending everything they had to correct that mistake. He gripped the plasma rifle tighter. Blood crusted along his knuckles. His body ached from the countless wounds he had sustained, but exhaustion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was past the point of retreat. The hunt had escalated into something else entirely, extermination. The jungle trembled beneath the weight of armored boots. He crouched in the shadows of a massive tree, its gnarled roots rising from the ground like skeletal fingers. The Zarkuan warriors fanned out in disciplined formation, moving with the efficiency of seasoned killers. There were no mistakes now, no arrogance. They had seen what he was capable of, and they had adapted. A worthy challenge. Ethan slowed his breathing, listening, calculating. 5 of them, spread wide but covering angles, too far apart for a single strike to take out more than one at a time. He needed something bigger. His gaze flicked to the ruined remnants of a fallen drone half buried in the dirt. The power cell was still intact. A risk, but risks were all he had left. Moving like a phantom, he pried the cell free, feeling the latent heat thrumming beneath his fingers. He had seconds before they reached his position, wrapping the cell in a torn scrap of fabric. He placed it on a weak branch just within the clearing and backed away into the darkness. He let them come. A Zarkuan warrior stepped into view, its glowing visor sweeping the area, stopping just short of the hidden explosive. Another followed, then a third. The moment was razor-thin, a breath away from collapsing. Ethan raised his rifle and fired. The plasma bolt struck the power cell, igniting it in a white-hot blast that tore through the jungle like a living firestorm. The shockwave hurled 2 of the aliens to the ground, their armor scorched and cracked. One never moved again. The other staggered, disoriented, and Ethan was already moving. He fired twice, dropping the nearest warrior before diving behind a fallen tree as the last 2 returned fire. Plasma bolts hissed through the air, scorching bark, sending embers drifting into the thick jungle mist. The remaining Zarkuan were smart enough to take cover, but they had made a critical mistake. They had stopped hunting. Ethan surged forward before they could react. His rifle was out of charge, so he used it as a club, smashing it into the skull of the nearest soldier. The alien reeled, momentarily stunned, and Ethan drove his knee into its gut before grabbing its own blade and driving it deep between its ribs. The last warrior roared in fury and charged, swinging a crackling energy blade. Ethan barely ducked in time, the heat singing his skin as the weapon carved a molten gash through the air. He rolled, snatching up a discarded plasma pistol, and fired point-blank. The final Zarkuan collapsed, smoke rising from the smoldering hole in its chest. Silence fell once more, broken only by Ethan's ragged breathing. The jungle was littered with bodies, the ground soaked in alien blood. But this wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones, a weight heavier than fatigue. Killing them here was just the beginning. As long as their kind existed, the hunt would continue. He turned toward the fallen dropship, its ramp still open, the engine still humming. He had an idea. A reckless, brutal idea. Climbing into the cockpit, he pushed aside the lifeless pilot and studied the controls. The language was alien, but the function was familiar. A warship, designed for rapid deployment, and it still had clearance codes. His mind sharpened. If he could get off this planet, if he could reach the heart of their empire, he could end this at its source. The ship lifted into the sky, punching to the jungle canopy, firelight shrinking beneath him. The navigation system projected a course toward the Zarkuan's homeworld. Ethan engaged the drive, feeling the ship shudder as it accelerated into the void. His wounds burned, his body screamed for rest, but none of that mattered. Hours passed in a haze of adrenaline and pain. When the homeworld loomed ahead, a planet of jagged spires and blood-red skies, he knew there was no turning back. Alarms blared as the ship's false credentials failed, but he was already descending, already locked on to his target. A hunting facility, One of many, a place where human captives were sent to be slaughtered for sport. He crashed through the docking bay, the impact sending shockwaves through the facility. The ship groaned, flames licking at its hull, but Ethan was already on his feet, already moving. He tore through the corridors, plasma rifle stolen from the wreckage clutched in his hands. Guards rushed to meet him. He cut them down. Sirens howled. He kept moving. The main chamber was a grotesque display of alien cruelty. Cages filled with human prisoners, some battered, some barely conscious. Above them, Zarkuan elites watched from raised platforms, their mandibles twitching in disbelief. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The hunt is over. He raised a plasma rifle and fired. The facility erupted in chaos. The elite warriors leaped down to face him, but he was past fear, past mercy. He fought with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had nothing left to lose. He used their own weapons against them, turned their own technology into instruments of destruction. The cages burst open, prisoners scrambling free, taking up arms, turning the tide. By the time the last Zarkuan lay dead, the facility was in flames. Ethan stood among the wreckage, watching as the prisoners fled into stolen ships, escaping into the stars. He had done what he came to do. He had torn a hole in the heart of the hunt, made them feel the fear they had inflicted for generations. But he wasn't finished. He picked up a Zarkuan communicator, tuned it to a frequency that would broadcast across their entire empire. His voice was calm, steady, absolute. You wanted sport. You wanted the thrill of the hunt. Now you have it. He let the silence stretch, the weight of his words settling into the darkness. I am coming for all of you. Ethan Cross woke up to the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. His head throbbed, and his limbs ached as he struggled to consciousness, the sharp scent of damp earth filling his nostrils. The air was thick, humid, and carried the distant shrieks of unseen creatures. Instinct kicked in before memory. He didn't move. He listened. The silence was unnatural. No wind stirred the dense foliage. No insects buzzed. Then, the mechanical whir of a drone passed overhead. Ethan's mind sharpened in an instant. He wasn't just anywhere. He was being watched. His last clear memory surfaced. The Zarkuan, towering reptilian warriors clad in biometallic armor, their cruel laughter echoing as they threw him into a containment cell. They had taken him for the hunt. His pulse steadied as he scanned his surroundings. A jungle, alien, yet familiar in its primal hostility. The ground beneath him was damp, the trees stretching impossibly high, their bioluminescent veins pulsating in eerie rhythms. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and somewhere in the distance, something let out a guttural, clicking growl. He was not alone. Memories of his capture sharpened. A mission gone wrong. His team slaughtered. Their bodies taken, perhaps as trophies, perhaps as food. He had been spared, for sport. A lesser man might have panicked. But Ethan had spent his life in the dark places of war, where survival was measured not in strength, but in adaptation. A red flash blinked in his peripheral vision. Turning slightly, he spotted a sleek, hovering drone perched on a thick tree branch, its single optic whirring as it zoomed in on him. They were watching. They were waiting. He was supposed to run. Ethan did the opposite. He shot forward, faster than the drone could react, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground and hurling it with practiced precision. The impact shattered the drone's optic, sending it spiraling to the ground with a metallic screech. His heart pounded. He had seconds before they came. The first mistake a hunted man could make was believing he was powerless. Ethan had no weapons, no armor, but he had the jungle. He had his training. He moved swiftly, his mind calculating probabilities with every step. He crouched low, pressing his fingers into the mud, feeling its density. Good. Wet enough to mold, thick enough to dry fast. Camouflage. He smeared it across his arms, his face, his chest, the cold seeping into his skin like an old companion. A rustling above. A heavy thud. They were here. He pressed himself into the roots of a massive tree, slowing his breath, forcing his muscles into stillness. Through the dense underbrush, he saw movement. 3 figures. Tall, armored, moving with a predator's confidence. Their weapons pulsed with latent energy, sleek and brutal. They were speaking in their guttural tongue, but Ethan didn't need to understand the words. He could read their body language. They expected an easy kill. The leader gestured towards a downed drone, his mandibles clicking in annoyance. One of the others broke off, stalking toward it. Ethan tensed, muscles coiling, heart a steady drumbeat in his ears. He could almost hear his old instructor's voice. Always let the enemy believe they are in control, until they aren't. As the alien bent down to examine the wreckage, Ethan struck. He launched from the shadows, wrapping his arms around the creature's thick, armored neck. With a vicious twist, he felt the bones snap. The body slumped, and Ethan caught the plasma rifle before it hit the ground. The other two turned, roaring in alarm, but Ethan was already diving, rolling into the underbrush. Plasma fire scorched the air above him, but he moved like a ghost, shifting to the foliage, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He had a weapon now, but he didn't fire. He didn't need to. He wasn't hunting them with a rifle. He was hunting them with fear. One of them made the mistake of rushing into the jungle after him. A fatal miscalculation. Ethan had already looped back, using the darkness to his advantage. He waited, breath steady, fingers tightening around the hilt of a fallen branch. The moment the alien passed, Ethan struck, driving the sharp witch straight through the soft gap between the creature's ribs. The alien let out a choking gurgle, collapsing to his knees before Ethan silenced it with a final, brutal twist. 2 down. The leader stood at the edge of the clearing, scanning the jungle with slow, methodical precision. This one wasn't like the others. Smarter, more experienced. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting. A test of patience. Ethan crouched lower, willing his heartbeat to slow, his breathing to disappear into the night air. The alien turned slightly, and for a moment, their eyes met. A flicker of understanding passed between them. This was no longer a hunt. This was war. Ethan shifted subtly, deliberately. A distraction. The alien's gaze flicked a movement, just enough for Ethan to strike from the opposite direction. He surged forward, slamming the butt of the plasma rifle into the alien's skull. The warrior staggered, but it wasn't enough. With a swift movement, the Zarkuan lashed out, its claws raking across Ethan's side. Pain seared through his ribs, but he didn't falter. They grappled. 2 predators locked in a brutal contest of will. The alien was stronger, but Ethan was faster, more ruthless. He drove his elbow into the creature's throat, then grabbed its own blade from its belt and plunged it deep into its gut. The alien shuddered, its mandibles clicking in shock. Ethan twisted the blade. It slumped to the ground, lifeless. Silence. Ethan stood, his chest heaving, his side bleeding, but his grip steady. He wiped the blood from his mouth, looking down at the 3 bodies sprawled in the dirt. The Zarkuan believed they had been hunting a man. They had no idea they had created a monster.